What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my updated rest of season wide receiver rankings with the big trades, Devontae Adams going to the Jets, Amari Cooper going to the Bills, along with some of the injuries. I just thought this would be a good opportunity to kind of look at the wide receivers here. If you guys enjoy the video, hit that like button, subscribe. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts, which players you think should be higher or lower. Obviously, it's going to depend on where your team is sitting. If you have a rough record, you're probably going to need some of these more win now options. If you have a good record, maybe you can take a swing on some of the guys that could break out later on in the year, maybe some of these younger wide receivers who could, have these late season breakouts. But let's just dive right into it here. Starting off in tier one, my wide receiver one rest of season, I do think it's an argument for who could be the top dog. Personally, I'm going to go with Jamar Chase here in tier one. He's currently leading all wide receivers in touchdowns. He is number 2 in yards and yak. And I think he has an opportunity here to grow on his 22% target share. I think rest of season, that number is going to be much higher. So the efficiency's been there. The touchdowns have been there. He just needs a little bit more volume. And I do think he can get that. And then my number 2, my other tier 1 wide receiver, it's going to be Justin Jefferson. He has been the focal point of this Vikings offense. He has a 34.4% target share, which is insane. He has a 41.6% air yard share. So they are running this offense through Justin Jefferson. Obviously, the quarterback play is there with Sam Darnold. I like him here as a high-end wide receiver 1. Then looking at tier 2, also guys who I think are in contention for wide receiver 1 rest of season. To lead off this tier, I'm going to go with Malik Nabers. He is averaging 22.9 PPR points per game in his first 4 games. He is leading all wide receivers in target share. The only kind of red flag here is that he has missed the last 2 games with a concussion. And at the time that I'm recording this, he is still not cleared concussion protocol. So you'd like to see him return here. You don't want to see him miss 3 games with a concussion. I think it also just adds a little bit of uncertainty rest of season. If he suffers another one, then you're probably looking at another pretty lengthy, absence. So that's the concern with Malik Nabers. But the dude's coming as a rookie, put up insane production, and he could truly be the wide receiver 1 rest of season. After Nabers, I'm going to go with A.J. Brown here. He's only played in 2 games, but in those 2 games, he has gone 5 for 119 and a touchdown, and then 6 for 116 and a touchdown. So 2 monster games. He hasn't really been someone who's hit that 18 plus point per game area, but this definitely could be the year with how he started off in his first 2 healthy games. Then I have CeeDee Lamb, definitely been a disappointment to start off the season. He was pretty much drafted as the consensus wide receiver 1. If he wasn't wide receiver 1, he was probably number 2 off the board behind Tyreek Hill, but he's only averaging 15.4 PPR points per game. He is the wide receiver 17 points per game, and this Cowboys offense just hasn't really been clicking. It's not like their weapons are significantly different from last year. It just hasn't panned out to start off the season. I am expecting a bounce back, but I also don't think I can put them up here with these guys who, were drafted highly and are producing at a very, very high level. And then a couple more guys in this tier. My wide receiver 6 is going to be Amon-Ra St. Brown. He hasn't had an amazing start to the season. He's the wide receiver 12 in points per game, but the usage is there. He's 6th in target share. He's 5th in red zone targets. I think that the main reason he's had a little bit of an underwhelming start is just the fact that the Lions haven't been in a lot of trailing game scripts. They haven't needed to throw a ton of passing volume out there. I believe Jared Goff only has 1 game above 30 pass attempts. So I feel like that's kind of the issue here for Amon-Ra. But he was a high-end, to mid-tier wide receiver 1 last year. He'll be fine as a nice wide receiver 1 rest of season. And then the final guy in this tier is going to be Cooper Kupp. And it seems like he has an opportunity to return this week, coming off of that ankle injury. And I do think it's important for Kupp to get back before Puka Nacua, because we saw last year, Kupp was injured to start off the season. Puka Nacua got off to a really hot start through the first 4 games. And then Puka kind of maintained as that wide receiver 1. This year, heading into the season, I like both of these dudes. Puka goes down week 1. Kupp has a monster week 1. Then we go into week 2. And he injures his ankle. So it seemed like he was set up to potentially be the wide receiver 1 rest of season. Didn't happen because he went down with injury. But I feel like if he can get back to 100% before Puka's back in there, I do think he could be this team's lead wide receiver. And we've seen it. They're going to pepper him with volume. As long as the health is there, I do think Cooper Kupp belongs in tier 2. Now looking at tier 3, going to start off this tier with Tyreek Hill, and he has been a massive bust from where he was drafted. He has 4 straight games under 13 PPR points. He has also scored under 9 PPR points in 3 of his last 4. And Tyreek Hill's upside, his value rest of season, is just so strongly tied to Tua's health. If Tua is back, next week after missing the mandatory 4, you can make a very strong case that Tyreek Hill is in like that wide receiver one contention. The problem is like he's maybe not even startable as a wide receiver two without two in the lineup. So like the ceiling is there, but the floor also seems very, very low because you're relying on Tua's health, who obviously has the concussion issues. So I feel like wide receiver 8 is fair, just trying to balance the ceiling and the floor, but definitely a tough player to rank without knowing exactly what's going on with Tua's situation. Then my wide receiver 9 is going to be Chris Godwin. He's the current wide receiver 4 in points per game. He is leading all wide receivers in receptions, tied for the lead in touchdowns, and he is number 1 in yak. So Chris Godwin has had an amazing start to the season. I do think he's going to be a wide receiver 1 moving forward. I do think the production between him and Mike Evans is probably going to close, a little bit. I don't think he's just going to completely run away with it, but I do think he's a wide receiver 1 moving forward. Then I have Jaden Reed as my wide receiver 10. In the 4 games with Jordan Love, he's averaging 22.2 PPR points per game. With Love at quarterback, Jaden Reed has been an absolute monster. We saw him produce in year 1. Now year 2, he's dominating. I do think he's a wide receiver 1 play and a top 10 option. And then the final guy in this tier, it's going to be Drake London. He is the current wide receiver 9 in points per game. He is 3rd in receptions. He's also 3rd in red zone targets. So he has that touchdown upside. He's being heavily targeted by Kirk Cousins. I definitely think he belongs here as like that back end wide receiver 1 area. Now pivoting into tier 4, going to start off this tier with T. Higgins. He is the current wide receiver 15 in points per game. And he's kind of been this guy where heading into the season, I did like him. I kind of thought like his ceiling was like that back end wide receiver 1 territory. I feel like he's probably still in that range, but he's actually out-targeted Jamar Chase in the last 3 games. He is earning volume. He's on a very good passing attack. This is also a Bengals team where the defense has really struggled. They've had to get into some high-volume passing games. That's obviously going to benefit these wide receivers. And then he also almost has like that added in wide receiver handcuff value, where if Jamar Chase goes down, then T. Higgins is just like a locked in wide receiver 1 rest of season. A guy in a very similar situation is Devonta Smith, another guy who's like the wide receiver 2 behind an elite wide receiver 1. And Devonta Smith has just been very consistent, 14 plus PPR points in all of his games. And just like T. Higgins, if A.J. Brown goes down, he's locked in as a weekly wide receiver 1. Then I have Davante Adams, the first guy who's kind of making a big swing here just based on the trade. And I think, you could go a variety of different ways here with how you're breaking down this trade, how you're viewing Davante Adams, Garrett Wilson, this Jets offense. For me, I'm buying in pretty heavily here to this Davante Adams, Aaron Rodgers connection. I just think you look at Rodgers, Garrett Wilson. Rodgers was peppering him with targets, especially over the last couple of weeks, but it still didn't seem like the fit was there. It doesn't seem like the chemistry was great. We're looking at all those targets that Garrett Wilson is getting peppered with. I think a lot of those are now going to go to Davante Adams. Now, the Allen Lazard targets, the other opportunities could go to Garrett Wilson, not saying like all his opportunities are going to be gone, but I would prefer Davante Adams here in this wide receiver room. You could definitely make the argument that neither of these guys are in their prime with Adams, Aaron Rodgers, but they have the chemistry. I don't think this is a situation where like you have a wide receiver traded going into a brand new situation. They don't have any familiarity with the coaching staff, the players. Like I feel like Davante Adams is going to be able to step in and produce pretty quickly. So I do favor him over Garrett Wilson at this point. I'd be willing to hear other opinions if you do prefer Garrett Wilson or you think Adams should be ranked lower, but I do just think he's going to get peppered with targets. I still think he has a lot of juice as a wide receiver, so I'm going to have him here as a higher end wide receiver 2. Then I have Stephon Diggs, who's been really impressive this season, 17 PPR points per game, and I think moving forward, as long as Nico Collins is out, Stephon Diggs is going to be locked in as a weekly wide receiver 1 play. Then I have Marvin Harrison Jr., and I could understand people being lower on him. This kind of comes down to like, where's your team at? Do you need these instant wins, or can you play for someone with some longer term upside? He's averaging 13.8 PPR points per game in his 5 healthy games, currently dealing with a concussion, which isn't ideal, but I feel like we've seen enough through the first 5 weeks where we know this dude's talented. I think we can project that him and Kyler Murray are going to get more on the same page. I think his production will be better later on. You just kind of have to determine, am I in a position to wait for him to break into that, potential top 12 wide receiver range, or do I need these wins now? I need a more win now option as opposed to, a younger player. Then I have Mike Evans, who's averaging 14.3 points per game. He's just been super boomer bust through 6 weeks. He has 3 games with 23 plus PPR points, and then he has 3 games where he's scoring under 8 PPR points. Like I talked about with Chris Godwin, I do think the production gap is going to close a little bit, but I do still prefer Chris Godwin at this point. Just seems like he's like the favored wide receiver with this new offensive coordinator. And then going back to a younger option, we have Brian Thomas Jr. here. He's averaging 14 and a half PPR points per game as a rookie. Not coming off a great last game. Week 6 was his worst performance. Not great that it coincides with the return of Evan Ingram, but I still think he's flashed his talent. I do view him as the number one target here for the Jaguars. So Brian Thomas Jr., someone who theoretically should continue to get better as a young player. He's shown us the talent. I still think he's going to be a great fantasy play moving forward. And then the final guy in this tier, it is going to be Terry McLaurin. In his last 4 games, he's averaging 18.7 PPR points per game. Now, do I think that's sustainable rest of season? Probably not. Like, him and Richardson are really connecting down the field at a high level. He's also caught 4 of Daniels' 6 touchdowns. I might have said Anthony Richardson, meant Jane Daniels. He's caught 4 of his 6 passing touchdowns, which obviously not sustainable, but you could also make the case that Daniels could up that passing volume, up those passing touchdowns. I just think he's a nice mid-tier wide receiver to play. And just for Terry, like, it's good to see a quarterback actually starting to unlock him here. He's had such rough quarterback luck throughout his career. It's fun to see him and Daniels on the same page. This Commanders offense looks really strong, so you have to feel great if you drafted Terry McLaurin. Now, shifting into tier 5, going to start off this tier with Chris Olave. And I think some people are going to think this is too high just based on how beat up the Saints offense is. And I do get that. Chris Olave dealing with a concussion. Derek Carr going to be out for a few weeks here. We have Rashid Shaheed, who I do not have in these rankings. At the time I'm recording this, we know he's getting some sort of surgery. Seems like he could either be out like 4 weeks or potentially rest of season. I think for Chris Olave here, even with the injuries, if Rashid Shaheed is out for an extended period of time, Chris Olave is just going to be getting peppered with targets. It's not ideal that with Rashid Shaheed healthy, who actually was commanding targets at a pretty high level, if you have bad quarterback play, bad O-line play, and there's like multiple guys you need to feed, like that's not going to be great for Chris Olave. I think in a spot where he's the clear-cut number 1, he could still be fine. We know he's very talented. And then you're just hoping like Derek Carr can get back and the offensive line can get healthy, find some consistency. And then after Chris Olave, we have another dude who's banged up right now. It is Nico Collins, currently on IR with a hamstring injury. He's missed 1 of the 4 necessary games, but when healthy, he was the wide receiver 3 in points per game. So you're just kind of playing like the injury luck at this point. Like, you're hoping he's back after the mandatory 4. You're hoping he's back to the production he was giving you before he went down. And it's kind of the spot where if you're sitting at 6-0, 5-1, maybe 4-2, but you feel good about your team, you can take on the risk of an injured guy like Nico Collins, because in the short term, you might suffer, but long term, he could be a league winner for you. If you are in a spot where you've gotten off to a rough start, then you probably want to trade him for some of these more win now options, the healthy pieces in the same area. But when he's been on the field, he's been an absolute monster. So definitely a tough injury to see, especially because I was very invested in him for fantasy. And you feel like you get a great hit and then they go down. Definitely tough. After Nico Collins, going with DK Metcalf. This might seem low for Metcalf here, but I feel like at some point we kind of just have to accept what DK Metcalf is. He is the current wide receiver 24 in points per game. He's been pretty boom or bust this season, but we just look back to his last 3 full seasons. He has finished between the wide receiver 20 and the wide receiver 24 in points per game. So over the last 4 seasons, he is somewhere in like the mid to back end wide receiver 2 area. If you're going to show me year after year that's where you belong, at some point I'm going to have to believe you. Even though it seems like he should be better, should have a better fantasy ceiling, it hasn't come through. So I just don't know how I rank him any higher at this point. Then I have Puka Nacua, another one of these like injury plays. Seems like he could be back week 8, week 9 area. There's just some uncertainty there. When he is on the field, I do think at worst he's like a high-end wide receiver 2. So can you deal with him missing a few weeks here? And then I have Deebo Samuel, the current wide receiver 23 in points per game. He's just in a spot with a pretty crowded wide receiver room. You have Brandon Ayuk, you have George Kittle, who's been dominant. You're probably going to get Christian McCaffrey within the next 3-4 weeks, who's also going to be involved as a pass catcher. And I don't think it's ideal that Deebo hasn't like completely killed it with Brandon Ayuk struggling, because we'll talk about Ayuk later, but he's been rough. And so the fact that Ayuk has not been producing and Deebo hasn't been a monster, that's not ideal also. And then the final guy in this tier, it's going to be Garrett Wilson. He has 33 targets over the last 2 games. I do think, him being the target leader is probably going to fade away with Davante Adams coming in. I still think he's going to be playable. I think some things are going to be opened up for him with Davante Adams coming in, but I also don't think he's like the clear-cut target hog like it looked like he was going to be over the past couple of weeks. Now, pivoting into tier 6, going to start off this tier with someone who was just traded. It is going to be Amari Cooper. And this is an interesting situation here because he's going from arguably the worst offensive situation in the NFL with the Browns, Deshaun Watson as his quarterback, to now likely being the clear-cut number one target on a Josh Allen-led offense. It's interesting, though, because this season, Amari Cooper has honestly been pretty rough. Like, he's 7th in targets, only 30th in receptions. He is leading the NFL in drops. And so he hasn't played well. So the question is, like, is that going to carry over to the Bills? Is he kind of falling off? Is he, like, getting washed at this point? I could also see the situation where you're on this Browns offense, the quarterback play is terrible, you're not fully locked in. Now you're going to a contender, first in the division compared to the Browns, who are just awful. And now I could see Amari Cooper just completely bouncing back to what we've seen, pretty much throughout his entire career. So I'm leaning more towards the fact that I think he's probably going to bounce back. I just feel like that situation is so tough. Probably wasn't, fully all in. Not saying that's, right or what should happen, but I do think that's definitely a possibility here for Amari Cooper. So I think he's going to be a nice option. I do think the difference between like the Amari Cooper trade and the Davante Adams trade is that Amari Cooper doesn't have familiarity like with this offense, with Josh Allen. Davante Adams stepping in with his former quarterback should be able to just, step right in and ball out. For, Amari Cooper, I don't know if it's going to be the same thing, but still, wide receiver one upside on this Bills offense, definitely a fun option. And if you were, holding the bag on Amari Cooper, you were probably very, very frustrated. You go from him being like, I guess, the top target on just one of the worst offenses in the NFL to now being the potential top target on one of the best offenses. I do also just want to talk about some of the other wide receivers here for the Bills because you have guys like Khalil Shakir, who was kind of looked at as the wide receiver one. Also, Keon Coleman, who I feel like people are bearing at this point. I think it's kind of interesting with this Bills wide receiver room because I think you can make the case that outside of Mac Hollins, all their other top wide receivers probably should be playing out of the slot. I think Khalil Shakir definitely, can thrive in there. Keon Coleman, even though he doesn't seem like your prototypical slot guy, I think he's probably better off as a big slot than trying to separate and win on the outside. And then also Curtis Samuel, probably better off in the slot. So it'll be interesting if Amari Cooper being like that clear-cut wide receiver one on the outside kind of unlocks things either for Khalil Shakir or a guy like Keon Coleman. These guys aren't going to crack my top 40, but definitely something to keep an eye on there, especially for Keon Coleman. Like if they really shake up his usage, play him out of the slot more, could be interesting, even though it seems like everyone thinks he's just like left for dead at this point. Then after Amari Cooper, going with Jalen Waddle here, kind of in a weird spot because if Tua is healthy, you could probably make a case for him to be as high as like the T. Higgins, Devonta Smith area, like in that group of guys where they're like a high-end wide receiver 2, back-end wide receiver 1 if things are going well, wide receiver 2 behind stud wide receiver 1s. The problem is he's just completely unplayable if Tua is not healthy. He has scored under 10 PPR points in the last 4 games. So it's like, do you believe in the Tua injury? Like how long do you think he's going to be out? So just kind of wait and see here with Waddle. Then I have Deontay Johnson, and this does feel low for Deontay because in his last 4 games with Dalton at quarterback, he's put up 18.3 PPR points per game. Here is my concern. The Panthers are not winning, and they also did not trade Bryce Young. So I feel like if the Panthers were completely done with Bryce Young, they would have moved him, gotten what they could for him. But the fact that they're still holding on to him and the record is so bad, at some point, I think we're going to see Bryce Young back in there. And like we saw in the first couple of weeks, that could completely nuke Deontay Johnson's value. So if it was Dalton like locked in at quarterback rest of season, you could probably make an argument for Deontay like in that tier 3 area. But we could also be in a spot where Deontay Johnson balls out over the next few weeks, but then we're getting like close to the fantasy playoffs and they want to see what they have out of Bryce Young, and then his production totally tanks. So we do have to factor in that risk. I feel like it's almost like the inverse of the Jalen Waddle thing. Like Waddle's going to be unplayable until Tua is back. Deontay Johnson's going to be super playable potentially until Bryce Young comes in. So that's what I'm wrestling with there with Deontay. Then up next, I'm going to go with DJ Moore after Deontay. He's averaging 13.5 PPR points per game. I do think he's interesting rest of season because Caleb has started to look better. The problem is this is just a very crowded wide receiver room. They're spreading the ball around. You have Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze, DeAndre Swift out of the backfield. Cole Kmet is making plays. So I just don't know if that upside is there, but I definitely could see him improving on what he's done so far this season. Then I have Zay Flowers. kind of in an interesting spot because he's had three big games, 3 games with 19 plus points, but he's kind of being held down in his point per game number because he had 2 just really bad, low volume games, under 6 PPR points. So I feel like the question is, like, were those just 2 really bad, like, outlier games early on in the season? Or is this a thing where in bad game scripts, he's just going to be a non-factor? I feel like we still have to wait and see. Maybe wide receiver 30 is too low. I could see an argument for him being higher, but even on the season, he's at 13.7 points per game, and that low floor is something we do have to consider here. Then my wide receiver 31 is going to be Xavier Worthy, and I think a lot of people are going to think this is way too high because he has not been a super reliable option, but this is a long-term play here for Xavier Worthy. I just want to flash back to last season where Rashee Rice was pretty much unplayable for the first, 2/3 of the season. Like, you could not play him in your lineup. He wasn't even running starting routes, and that was in a much weaker wide receiver room where, you didn't have Rashee Rice in there to start off the season compared to a guy like Xavier Worthy, who was a starting wide receiver with Rashee Rice in there. Rashee Rice, in his last 6 games of 2023, put up 18.5 PPR points per game. So he went from unplayable to all of a sudden he is a league winner for you down the stretch, someone you could have picked up off of the waivers. I feel like Xavier Worthy has that type of upside in him. And like I said, he is starting off on a better playing field than Rashee Rice, where Rashee Rice had to work his way into a starting role. Xavier Worthy has already earned that. Now, you could definitely make the argument that Juju is going to step in, play that volume role that Rashee Rice was getting, but I'm not fully convinced that Juju is going to be this huge factor moving forward. He had 1 big game. Maybe he keeps it going. I'm a little bit skeptical. I would rather buy into the upside of a young rookie who I think could, massively improve their usage rest of season. He does need to start commanding targets. I will say that the volume has been too low, but I do think that could come. And like I said at the top, if you need wins now, he's probably not your guy. But if you're a contender that can buy low on him, you have a great record, he's definitely someone who could bring that chip for you home later on in the season. And then I'm going to go with Brandon Ayuk here. Definitely a tough player to rank because based on previous seasons, we know the talent is there, but it has just not come through this season. He has scored under 10 PPR points in 5 of his 6 games. And it's just that tough balance of how much do we weight what he's done in previous seasons versus how bad he's been this year. I feel like mid-tier wide receiver 3 is probably fair. If you can get him for pretty much nothing, like the owner's just done with him, I definitely would, because like I said, the talent's there. The slow start, I guess, can be attributed to him kind of holding out, not being involved in training camp. And if that's the argument, then at some point he should start to come through here, but definitely a very, very less than ideal start to the season. Then the final guy in this tier, it is going to be Jameson Williams. He's put up 14 plus PPR points in 4 of his 5 games. The one thing I am somewhat concerned about is he has seen a volume dip. After the first 2 weeks, he was sitting at 20 total targets, which was amazing for someone with his big playability. In the last 3 weeks, he only has 9 total targets. Now, he has still continued to make some big plays. He's always going to have that long touchdown upside, but you would like to see the volume at least balance out between what we saw in the first 2 weeks and then what we've seen in the last 3. Now, pivoting into tier 7, the final tier here, we're going to start this tier off with Tank Dell. We saw him in his first game without Nico Collins. Really solid game, 18.7 PPR points. I was someone who was really high on Tank Dell heading into the season. That is not looking like a great call at this point, but I do think if he can gain some momentum with Nico Collins out, he's someone who could still end up being startable once Collins is back. Then I have Ladd McConkey. The fantasy production hasn't been amazing, but the usage has been very encouraging. 27% target share, 30% target rate. He's just going to need some passing volume, and maybe that doesn't happen this year. They want to be super run heavy, but you have Justin Herbert at quarterback. I do think at some point they're going to have to let the leash off of this offense, and I think that could definitely benefit Ladd McConkey. Then I have Jacoby Myers. Looks like the Raiders wide receiver 1 without Davante Adams. He has commanded 9 plus targets in his last 3 games, so the volume has been there. Obviously not a great offense, and you'd have Brock Bowers, who's probably going to be their number 1 target, even if Myers is the wide receiver 1, but definitely someone who could be playable as a wide receiver 3 moving forward. Then I have Jordan Addison, just a talented young player who's on an offense that looks like they're going to be pretty solid moving forward. You would like to see him put together a solid game or 2 before you get Hawkinson back in there, just so he can really lock down his role as the potential number 2 target. But a young, talented player on a good offense, undefeated team, definitely think he's in this fringe wide receiver 3 territory. Then I have Darnell Mooney. Solid start to the season, wide receiver 28 in points per game, Not sure if there's like a ton of upside beyond that. Like I don't really expect him to jump into that wide receiver 2 territory, but definitely someone who's playable as a wide receiver 3. Then I have George Pickens, who's been pretty much the opposite of Darnell Mooney. He has not been productive this season. He is the wide receiver 49 in points per game. The problem is his usage doesn't look that terrible. Like he has a 29% target share. He is 7th in air yards. He's 5th in deep targets. He's 10th in red zone targets. So in terms of like the valuable opportunities, they've been there. He just hasn't really come through. Maybe Russ potentially taking over at quarterback can kind of unlock him here. But I do think he's one of these players where he can run hot. I want to say it was last year or 2 years ago, you had like the quarterback shakeup where maybe Mason Rudolph came in and he just like went on a multiple game stretch of like catching deep touchdowns, and all of a sudden the production was magically there. So I do think he's going to get better rest of season. I do believe the talent is there. The one thing that kind of throws me off here with George Pickens, I guess besides like the bad production so far, is this weird usage they're doing where they're like, we're preserving him by not playing him all the snaps to then increase his productivity. Like if that's the actual argument, it's delusional from the Steelers coaching staff. He's their really only competent like offensive weapon out there in terms of their skill positions. And you need him out there literally every single snap. Like he needs to be out there running every single route. And could that happen moving forward? Sure, but just not a great sign that that's even like something they're considering. And then the final guy here, Josh Downs. Honestly, kind of sucks to rank him this low. He's the wide receiver 16 right now in points per game, sitting at 15.7. This is just a concern with Anthony Richardson. This is not a Josh Downs concern. I'm just worried that when Richardson takes over, the volume is going to be low. The completion percentage is going to be low. And you have other weapons here, with a Michael Pittman and Alec Pierce and Adonai Mitchell. And so I don't know if Josh Downs is going to be able to maintain. I'd be pretty shocked, actually, if he maintained the production we saw early on. So that's why I have him here as my wide receiver 40. If it was Flacco, I'd probably be getting reckless and have him somewhere in my top 24. And then a couple of honorable mentions. Courtland Sutton, I think, could definitely be interesting if Bo Nix improves. And then Wan'Dale Robinson, not a super high ceiling option, but has certainly been playable as like a wide receiver 3. And that is going to wrap it up for my top 40 rest of season rankings. Let me know your thoughts. If you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe. Thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.